I call David Seymour, 5 minutes.
Mr Speaker, I've greatly enjoyed tracking the Green position on dairy throughout today, in fact just throughout this afternoon. First we hear from Materia Ture that the current levels of farming need to be stepped in and subsidised by the government. Then we hear from Catherine Delahunty, who, as it turns out, hates old MacDonald after all and wants them to farm fewer cows. And now we come back to the member who's just resumed her seat, who believes that the level of farming has been overly subsidised, which makes me wonder why Materia Ture wanted to subsidise it to remain at that level in the first place. But it's been a very confused afternoon for the Greens on dairy, sir. I want to direct my comments to a long-suffering, long-forgotten and much neglected group of people in the budget policy statements, and that is the taxpayer. Because, Mr Speaker, without a taxpayer, we wouldn't have a budget, we wouldn't have government revenues, and there wouldn't be much to debate about today. But, Mr Speaker, haven't they been neglected? Because what we see in the government's fiscal strategy, is very clear. From $65 billion in taxes up to $85 billion in taxes in just 5 years. Mr Speaker, isn't it interesting to look at the new spending allowance? That is just, we're going to spend this much more money before we've identified a particular purpose. $1 billion in 2016, $2.5 billion in 2017, which just so happens to be an election year, $2 billion the year after that, and I think it was back to $1 billion for the midterm of the electoral cycle the year after that. Mr Speaker, this budget policy statement says the taxpayer is going to be neglected and is going to pay and pay and pay. Mr Speaker, I asked the Minister of Finance just a couple of days ago, how big does the surplus need to be before you'll start cutting taxes? And he could not give an answer, Mr Speaker. The National Party like to say that they will cut taxes, but the truth is they haven't really thought about, they haven't really committed to when they are prepared to start offering tax relief to New Zealanders who work, New Zealanders who have families, New Zealanders who have businesses. But, Mr Speaker, if the government was to deliver some ambition for giving relief to the taxpayer, I could make a couple of minor suggestions. And, Mr Speaker, these really are quite modest. But let's just have one. Time after time, the Minister of Finance says that there's not enough revenue coming in because there hasn't been enough inflation to push people into progressively higher tax brackets. Well, Mr Speaker, since when did a centre-right government support fiscal creep as a means of raising revenue? Mr Speaker, this government should be indexing tax brackets to inflation, and there's no better time to do it than when inflation is low and fiscal creep is having a lower effect than usual. But what indexation would do, Mr Speaker, is ensure that this government and future governments, if they want to take more money, they have to be honest and go to the taxpayer and say, we want to raise your taxes, not creepily allow them to drift into higher thresholds due to inflation. Mr Speaker, that's the first thing they could do, and the cost to the household is real. The average household in New Zealand has paid $1,500 in additional tax over the past 5 years just because of fiscal creep, just from being pushed into higher tax brackets by inflation. That's the average household, Mr Speaker, not even high-income households who have paid far, far, far more than that due to fiscal creep. Mr Speaker, the next thing that the government could do, if it got really ambitious about looking after the taxpayer, is that it could examine the fact that we have one of the highest effective tax rates on capital in the OECD. And it could actually make a conscious decision to reduce extra spending by just $120 million a year when it's planning to increase spending by $1 billion to $2.5 billion a year. It could set aside $120 million of extra spending to knock a point off the company tax rate and make Kiwi businesses competitive with the rest of the OECD. And, Mr Speaker, finally, if the government is worried about debt, it's got $28 billion in the New Zealand Super Fund that it could get rid of tomorrow, because I don't know anybody in New Zealand who would borrow money on their mortgage to play the global equity markets. That's what this government's doing, and for the taxpayers' benefit, it should wind up the New Zealand Super Fund, pay off debt, and finally reduce risk so we can start actually cutting taxes for the people that make this budget policy statement possible. Thank you.